Okay, there's no more Gargoyle baseline and no more Unholy Frenzy. No, it's Unholy Strike. No, it's Unholy Assault. Huh? Oh, Dark Transformation got baked into Apocalypse. Wait, they're reverting it. And they moved some talents around? What's going on with Unholy? Still big ass damn though, so who cares about design? Make sure you check our stream at twitch.tv/MarcelianOnline. We stream 5 days a week and test all sorts of specs and dungeons and raids, and sometimes doing it with you, the viewer. Hit a follow and see if you like what we do. See you there. On to some Unholy business. We already released a prior video talking about what became baseline, and you can check it out for some insight. After this one, of course. Gargoyle was made baseline and is now back as a talent. Epidemic is still baseline, which is nice. It could be that because of this, Gargoyle was made into a talent again. Either way, Epidemic being baseline is such a good change that it's just worth mentioning again. And another change that is worth mentioning again is Anti-Magic Zone. This alone could give Death Knights a spot in any group. Even in dungeons, which is the only content we get to test the specs in, the skill is super useful for at least 1 or 2 bosses and 1 or 2 pack types in every dungeon. A specific mention right here. Dark Transformation was made to be a part of Apocalypse when we recorded the gameplay, but it was announced it will become separate once again with the next alpha or beta build in this case, and it might already be that way by the time you watch this video. This change was made to address the GCD issue that Unholy had, and kinda still has, which we talked about it last time. It was a shit change, which is why they are reverting it. It will also pop an AoE damage wave once you activate it now. Pretty cool. Same thing happened to Apocalypse, which now refunds 2 runes after you use it. This is actually a nice change, and it addresses the GCD in the sense that it gives you a free Fester Strike after you pop up APOC, and you can place wounds on targets again. But this is just not enough because, well, it kind of inadvertently costs 4 runes to use because of, the cost of Fester Might. And we already lost the rune regeneration of Soul Reaper's mechanic. The difference is now that you don't have to talent it, which is a redundant option in my opinion, because you would always talent it no matter what, since Unholy is not only GCD heavy, but also rune heavy when it comes to the resources. I don't think making things cheaper from a rune perspective would be ideal, since rune management has always been an interesting part of Unholy gameplay. Although Pestilence pustules now could be best. Maybe give us ways to manage our runes then. Lastly, Outbreak received a small buff in its range and radius when applying it, so it won't be as big of a drag in AoE. So far, there might have been 1 pack per dungeon where I felt the need to reapply it because the mobs just moved at different speeds from different distances. It's annoying, and it definitely fucks up the setup since runes are a rare commodity and need to be spent pretty rigorously, or you could just end up waiting 3 seconds before continuing your rotation. Downtime. So yeah, better, but still no freaking clue as to why they changed it in the first place. Was fun and convenience overpowered? Not much changed for the Covenant abilities. Shackle the Unworthy from the Kyrians of Bastion is still a boring wet noodle. It only works in single target, and we are not going to talk damage here. Sure, if it ends up being buffed by 300%, it would be more interesting to play, but the baseline mechanic is shit and barely interacts with the spec itself. You place a dot on the enemy that lowers the damage they do to you, and doing some damage instead, of course. 5% damage reduction, and each rune you spend on attacks will reduce its cooldown by 4 seconds, with a base 1 minute cooldown. The only fun part of this is keeping it as high of an uptime as possible. Does not help in AoE, does not interact with anything other than its own cooldown being reduced, as long as you are not idle. Maybe its damage can be lowered, maybe bake in a mechanic to proc Runic Corruption or increase your Runic Corruption proc chance while it is active on a target. Anything at all, really. The Necrolords bring a fun ability in Abomination's Limb. It deals pretty piss poor damage compared to how it works for blood, but it does pull mobs into you. People have been asking for Mass Grip to be baseline for Unholy and Frost, and I guess this is Blizzard's way of saying, yeah, no, but look, you can get a shorter grip every second on one mob only. I'm being a bit of a dick, but the ability can have utility that would imply a pretty high skill cap and range awareness, because, you know, if a mob is more than 8 yards away from you, it will get pulled in. If you manage your pathing and keep moving, you can essentially keep breaking casts by pulling the mobs in. That's actually pretty cool. Would that utility overshadow raw DPS output of other options that they can provide? Subjective. Hardened World and the Night Fae actually come with the best ability damage-wise in Death's Due. This replaces Death and Decay and provides you with a scaling buff that reduces the damage your enemies inside of it do to you and increases your strength by up to 15%. It's hard to beat 15% extra strength and damage reduction on a decently high uptime. It also works with Defile if you're wondering, and yes, I did test it. It deals decent damage, but Defile might still not be the best talent in that role for AoE. Other than that, this is definitely better than the Kyrian one. The Venthyr though have Swarming Mist. Maybe not the best one out there, but has maybe one of the best interactions with your spec in that it provides you with massive runic power generation. Seems like this could be a thing if it's played with Gargoyle, which is now a dead talent because it's on the same row as Unholy Frenzy, sorry Assault. There could be one issue, but it depends on what build will end up being the norm. Unholy always thrived when popping Festering Wounds and managing them in AoE. Spending runic power was a bit cumbersome and delayed the setup for your next burst window, or could simply prolong your rotation by filling it with Death Coils or Epidemics. It could be a big hit or miss to have to cast a lot more of those depending on how the last iteration of Dark Transformation will be, and if the Army of the Damned will ever be a thing remains to be seen, because still we have downtime. The talents have changed slightly. Unholy Blight has been buffed since our last video. It still costs a rune and debuffs enemies with a stacking disease that increases your pet's damage to them by 3% per stack up to 12%. Now it will also apply Virulent Plague to nearby enemies. The Blight lasts for 6 seconds, during which time Virulent Plague gets refreshed and reapplied, entering its pandemic window. This is essentially the old Outbreak mechanic where the Virulent Plague kept reapplying for a few seconds. That, on top of the basic Blight damage and the percentage damage increase, kind of makes this a default pick right now. Everything on this row is essentially underwhelming at the moment. Everything other than Blight, because, you know, Blight is mega fun and it's a cool ability to use in this version, and with a 1 minute cooldown means you still have to press Outbreak now and again, which works poorly if the mobs are spread. So hopefully Blight will not get tuned down, because it does help with that. Soul Reaper got changed as well. It no longer has the rune refund mechanic, which was a big boost to Unholy's ability Bloat to use for a damage setup. The damage setup has been tuned down in terms of the GCDs you need to use, and Soul Reaper reverted back to its execute version, in that if the enemy or ad dies with it on them, then you get 10% haste for 8 seconds. On one hand, losing rune regeneration sucks, on the other, we cannot have them all. There is still downtime with the spec, and the current downtime is pretty impactful, and Soul Reaper does not help with it outside of it being a global you can press every 45 seconds, provided there is a mob close to dying every 45 seconds, unless you just press it for a dot damage. To replace Epidemic, you have Unholy Pact. We mentioned this last time, which has changed since. Not only did it move down a row, it now makes Fire Change the BFA Azurite trait deal incredible more damage, kind of establishing itself as the de facto AoE option. Not in every situation, however, but most of them. It's possible for Defile to be the best for single target if you choose the Night Fae Covenant. And that's great, built-in variety keeps the spec alive, and if we can handle that downtime... Summon Gargoyle is back as a talent because it was very fun to have it baseline, so we cannot have that. I spoke to the DK lads in Acarus, and one suggestion really made it appealing. If Gargoyle is going to be a talent, why not bake it into Army of the Damned? I mean, it is a soldier in your undead army to begin with. It would make Army of the Damned more appealing, which is already on a good track with it baking in the Magus of the Dead Azorite trait, but still not in terms of power gains. That might be too much considering how close we are to the pre-patch, but at the very least we could have these two buffed to compete with Unholy Assault. Previously Unholy Strike, and previous to that what it should be called Unholy Frenzy. Now it strikes the enemy in melee range with a big hit and applies 4 festering wounds and gives you 20% haste for 12 seconds. The haste is very good considering the downtime the spec has and how many abilities you have to use in a setup, even after the changes. The Unholy legendaries are interesting to say the least. Clearly, there are a lot of legendaries you can use outside of the 4 specific spec ones, and as far as this video goes, we will check the unholy ones though. Deadliest Coil reduces the cost of Death Coil by 10 runic power, and the spell itself increases the duration of Dark Transformation by 2 seconds. This essentially reduces the downtime the spec has, and it goes to show the devs what changes they would actually have to make so the baseline spec feels okay to play and not reliant on crutches like borrowed power. Death Certainty makes Death Strike and Death Coil deal 10% extra damage and reduce the cooldown of Defile or Death and Decay by 2 seconds. This mechanic will clearly trigger in single target scenarios only. You will only use Death Strike in case shit, and in AoE Epidemic will be your runic power spending ability, so no Death Coils. Since Night Phase synergizes the best with Defile, it might actually become the single target legendary of choice, seeing as how Defile in combo with Death's Due only outperforms Unholy Pact in single target. It's nice to see the synergy here, and hopefully future legendaries, if any, will play more on this aspect. Moving to what seems to actually wreak havoc in Shadowlands, Frenzied Monstrosity will make your Dark Transformation increase the damage and attack speed by 20% for you and your upgraded ghoul. This is pretty freaking cool. It seems we are moving ever so more into a world where melee attacks will start to do even more damage. Looking at my damage spread in the top 5 things that did the most damage, there are at least 2 instances of melee attacks, either yours as a DK, or your pets, or your ghouls, etc, etc. Lastly, a more situational option is Reanimated Shambler. Currently this sits at 1.5 rotational procs per minute, and it spawns a zombie that explodes for damage and applies a Fester wound on up to 8 targets. This is a bit RNG-ish and cannot be planned for. Having multiple wounds to burst makes me think of Bursting Sores, yet outside of the lost Festermite Azorite trait, Bursting Sores and Festermite wounds even are very underwhelming and unlikely to overshadow Unholy Blight and such, unless you're just fighting a large number of targets, which makes Bursting Sores good again. But no Festermite. And without the synergy, the Shambler is just a glorified AoE RNG burst contributor for a setup you want to have, which is okay, nice. Because if it spawns and you have no Death and Decay ready, then have fun tap targeting things with Scorch Strike. Soulbinds will be an interesting thing to test out. There are 12 in total, and each with at least 2 ways to build it based on what traits you want to unlock, as well as what conduit slots you want to combine into your build. Pelagos from the Kyrians, because some people just like to see the world burn, actually has 2 strong traits in Let Go of the Past, a passive that gives you an increasing versatility buff up to 5% as long as you keep alternating abilities in your rotation. It's not hard to do, but not always ideal. It also comes with Combat Meditation, which is a 5% mastery gain that lasts for 20 seconds, and longer if you pick up Sorrowful Memories that drop here and there. Since the Covenant ability is also on a short cooldown with high uptime, this buff can be maintained for quite a bit. Maldraxxus though, the Covenant for the real Death Knight, has Gnashing Chompers from Emily, which gives you haste for 20 seconds whenever you kill shit, and maybe the strongest crit trait in Heimir's Arsenal Marrowed Gemstone, a beast of a trait that gives you 20% crit chance for 20 seconds after you crit enough. Although with an internal cooldown of 1 minute, this could turn into something you work around so that you have a big ass 20-second damage window. But you will probably go with Night Fae, right? you will go with Night Fae, I just know it. Well, Dreamweaver starts with Field of Blossoms, a flower patch at your feet once you put down Death's Due. That gives you 5% haste while standing in the flowers. So pretty. And if that's not enough, Social Butterfly is a versatility ping pong passive that jumps from you to your allies and will net you and your group pretty big chunks of versatility if more than one person uses this. Since your gear might favor mastery and haste at the beginning, maybe. Versatility will just be a desired stat to get, since now stats have diminishing returns. Or maybe you are above all of that. Maybe you have class, the class of vampire lords and high society. So then just get Nadia, and dude, use her for Dauntless Duelist to deal 4% more damage to bosses, or at least the first target you engage in combat. And while you do that, you will proc Thrill Seeker every now and again for 20% more haste. Hot damn! We all know how much Unholy likes haste, no? So it's pretty good. And all of these builds and traits you will unlock will give you conduit options. Endurance conduits focus on defensives, stuff like Hardened Bones that will make your Lichborn also reduce the damage you take. Finesse conduits focus on utility and mobility. Chilled Resilience reduces the cooldown of Icebound Fortitude by 15 seconds. But what you really want are the potency ones that boost damage, although still need the others to an extent. Convocation of the Dead will make Festering Wound bursts, reduce the cooldown of Apocalypse by 0.5 seconds, scaling to what looks like 3.5 seconds at rank 15. Depending on the build, this can work nicely, but will desync it with Unholy Assault. So, embrace death? Your Sudden Doom procs will increase the damage of your next Death Coil by 40%, scaling to 100% at rank 15. This is a lot of damage to have in one conduit, particularly for single target. Or Eternal Hunger, increasing Dark Transformation's duration by 5 seconds up to 15 extra seconds at rank 15. Dude, take this with Unholy Pact and you will melt all the shit. Everything. Even their kitchen sink. While Lingering Plague makes Scorch Strike extend the duration of Virulent Plague. Looking at all of these, with the exception of one, it's all about duration increase and cooldown reduction. All of these mechanics essentially address downtime and GCD bloat. Blizz wasn't kidding when they said it's easier to balance class issues with expansion systems. But what happens when we lose them though? The devs seem to be taking steps in the right direction, but the spec is not there yet. The difficulty with designing and balancing the spec right now, after talking to the DK boys in Acuris and playtesting a bit myself, seems to be, as the Grain and Taze put it, two opposing issues: GCD and downtime. Downtime can be resolved by having more different globals to press, while the GCD system makes having a lot of globals to press feel cumbersome. The Dark Transformation loop the devs have done and the constant changes to Unholy Frenzy showcases the difficulty in designing this spec, but also their strive to actually do so. I do feel like Unholy is almost there. It has always been one of the best melee specs to play, for me, with its intricate system, resource and mechanics to juggle. What a proper nerd wants in 2020. We can only hope that devs that listen to us but still keep to their stubborn design of the GCD to look at some of the more advanced bits of feedback that not even my Clash Royale playing brain could have thought out. You can find a link to Tae's article in the description down below with some insight onto the Unholy issues that seem to be patch level changes and not actual reworks. Although, reworks. Reworks. And of course, down below you'll find a link to our Patreon if you like to support our channel and our content a little bit more, because we do have a lot of patrons that support us. And thank you very much, dear patrons, because without your help we wouldn't be here today with all of this cool shit in our studio to make all of this quality content and to help us do this for a living. So thank you very much for the support, guys. It's highly appreciated, highly helpful, but of course not mandatory. And of course you can also check our merchandise website. It's down below. You can find some hand-drawn, cool graffiti-style designs that Marcelian made for t-shirts and all sorts of goodies that you might find to your liking. So, thank you for watching the video, stay awesome, and we'll see you next time.
I've been loving it then, I still love it now. Still, I play WoW. Still, I play WoW. Getting better every day, let me show you how. Cause still, I play WoW. Still, I play WoW. It's getting harder to stay, but at the end of the day, it's a guilty pleasure, so just log in and play. Whether it's classic or retail, I'ma do a /bow. Still, I play WoW.